All right, in this section, we're going to talk now all about the psychological side of things or the psychotherapy side of the equation. We're going to talk through a bunch of different approaches and treatment methods that we can look at, both some historical examples and then also how we look at this using different strategies today, and kind of dive in and just kind of briefly touch on a lot of different approaches and methods that we can take. All right, so the first thing I want to kind of mention here, though, is how this approach is kind of handled. And so psychotherapy in general kind of looks at this cyclical relationship between different psychological systems or how we approach problems, how that might affect our thoughts, how those thoughts then affect our actions, how those actions then kind of in turn affect our feelings about things, and how those feelings feed back into the different systems and ways that we approach problems and ways that those then in turn affect our thoughts. And so we can see sort of this cyclical nature or this circle that happens with these different pieces of the puzzle. And so from the psychological side of things, we can look at how we can address maybe different parts of this equation to help the system as a whole. So we're going to look now at a few different approaches to therapy, specifically how we can group people and how we can look at therapy from different ways. So the first one is individual therapy. And this is probably what most people think about, just basically where a single individual is the main focus and they are going to therapy, talking with a therapist to address their own issues and focusing on themselves. And so this again looks at a therapist and an individual and works to focus on that individual and treat those problems alone. Then we have group therapy, and this is really, again, where we might have a group of individuals which all sort of have a very similar potential challenge or issue that they're dealing with, and one therapist can kind of work with the group as a whole to have sort of that social support of other people that are dealing with maybe the same problem as you, and the therapist can work to guide all of these individuals through the same general type of problem. And so we see a lot of this, one example of this is maybe something like Alcoholics Anonymous, where everyone is there kind of trying to support each other and go through and solve sort of the psychological distress that they're each going through. But it's all related in some way, and they can all kind of work together through this problem. Then we have couples and family therapy, and these are kind of just more nuanced or specific types of group therapy. So we have family therapy, which looks at a family unit, oftentimes caregivers and children, and can look to address problems from multiple points of view. Again, whether that is the parents or the children's point of view, or how maybe parents can deal with their issues with the children and the family unit as a whole in mind. Then we also have couples therapy, which focuses specifically on some type of romantic couple and the issues that they may be facing. So this, again, is an emphasis on approaching the problem from both people's points of view and trying to come to a mutual sort of understanding or beneficial outcome for both parties in the equation. So these are kind of the different ways that we can group people and how we can assess therapy from an individual versus a group perspective. Next, we're going to talk about some specific approaches or techniques once in therapy that can be applied in either individual or group settings, though some do tend to focus more on one versus the other. So the first approach here or technique is called insight therapy, and this was originally developed primarily by Sigmund Freud, and Freud kind of looked at this idea as, again, a way to get at the unconscious mind or those unconscious desires or problems that might be causing issues in your actual functioning. And so insight therapy used different techniques to try and access the unconscious mind and see what some of those problems were to then be able to bring them to light, understand them, address them, and hopefully fix them. And so some of the techniques that insight therapy used were things like psychoanalysis, or looking at things like dream analysis, or possibly free association, different ways, again, of accessing the unconscious and trying to understand what it was dealing with or going through. So maybe dream analysis was used to assess dreams as a way to kind of peer into the unconscious and provide meaning to what those dreams actually meant. Or maybe things like free association, where a word or a picture might be given, and the first thing that comes to mind is what you say, and that those can draw conclusions from that. Again, some potential limitations of this approach is that it can be prone to bias from the therapist. So the therapist themselves might bring in their own bias in this case because they are kind of having to interpret a lot of this and put meaning to it. And again, that is really up to them in doing that accurately. So this is one of the techniques that we've kind of moved a little bit away from, and we use less today than some of these other ones we're going to talk about. Next, we're going to talk more about behavioral therapy, which is a more common technique, and you can see some of the main sort of contributors to this field here. We'll talk a little bit about B.F. Skinner, Joseph Wolpe, and Hans Eysenck. All three of these were big contributors in the field of behavioral therapy, and each kind of helped kind of approach this problem from the behaviorist standpoint. So Skinner really relied on those operant conditioning behaviors, looking at how we can use different techniques to treat psychological disorders from that specific operant conditioning approach. Joseph Wolpe, on the other hand, used more of a classical or Pavlovian conditioning approach to treat different psychological disorders. And Eysenck really looked at this intersection between personality, behavior, and one's environment, and how all of these kind of played together to potentially look at, assess, and treat different psychological disorders. So let's kind of break these down. We'll talk about some examples from each of these. So first, looking at some different operant conditioning therapies. And so again, remember, operant conditioning relies on reward and punishment and making conscious choices to change your behavior. A couple examples of these are things like token economies, where you can kind of receive tokens or rewards based on different achievements that you've completed. Again, a good example of this is through something like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you can receive tokens or chips based on how many days or years or months that you've been sober or you've achieved your goals. There's other behavioral techniques that fall under this category as well. Oftentimes, enacting and following a strict schedule of behavior can be, again, a good way to have this operant approach where you are actively choosing and engaging in your behaviors, providing different rewards to engage in those behaviors. So as you continue doing something, you get rewarded in doing that. Next, we'll look at some different Pavlovian or classical conditioning techniques that we can see. And remember that this approach looks at unconscious responses or biological reflexes to different stimuli and ways that we can maybe change or control those reflexes. And some examples of these classical conditioning therapies are things like counter conditioning or maybe systematic desensitization, both of which work together to desensitize or reverse condition, basically to remove some conditioned response to some stimuli. Often this is focused around fear or some negative response to different stimuli or situations. The next major category we have are different humanistic theories or different humanistic therapies that we can use. And these really, again, focus on the human or the person as a whole. So humanistic therapy, again, is really designed or focused on this idea that people are naturally good and they want to better themselves in their life. And how can we help them achieve this goal? So generally, these therapies focus on utilizing aspects or techniques such as empathy, unconditional positive regard, generally just kind of explaining that the person is a good person and they need to kind of work towards and help achieve these goals. One really interesting and kind of specific technique under this humanistic theory category would be Gestalt therapy. And this one's really interesting, where the idea here is basically that they use a technique called the empty chair technique. And they'll have someone basically sit across from an empty chair and talk to the chair as if they are talking to a specific point of view or approach almost within themselves. And sometimes people then will even kind of switch seats and sit in that other chair and argue from that viewpoint. And the idea here is that it kind of looks at the person as a whole, each piece of them, and they're kind of talking through different parts or different points of view that they might have on different scenarios or conflicts. And so it helps them kind of see all the different pieces and then view them more holistically, and that they can then approach the problem from all angles and hopefully be able to come to some resolution to their problem. And then the last major category we have here is cognitive therapy. And cognitive therapy really revolves around, well, cognitions or thoughts of how we can approach different problems. And so oftentimes cognitive therapy revolves around this idea of how can we train someone to use different techniques, different thought techniques to approach a problem in a specific way that is more healthy or conductive to them solving the problem or eliminating it entirely. So an example of cognitive therapy would be something like rational emotive therapy, which really kind of looks at this idea that problems are primarily due to irrational beliefs. And so if we take this approach of utilizing the ABC approach, or the three kind of components of this approach, we can help to improve patients' outcomes. And so they look first to understand the activating event. So the A, what is it that actually triggered them to respond or behave in a certain way? And then B, their belief system about that event. So how do they interpret that event themselves? And then C, what is the emotional consequence of that event? So they have some emotional reaction to the event, and understanding each of these steps, you can then work to use strategies and techniques to change or improve or limit the reactiveness of each of these steps along the way. So maybe you understand the triggering event and you might be able to change sort of your belief about that event, which limits the emotional response to that event. And hopefully then in the future, if that event happens again, you are less likely to have such a strong emotional response and challenges with that event. And so we can also look at cognitive therapies to work and try and treat things like depression. And this often kind of revolves around this idea that these negative thoughts and beliefs are really automatic and they're hard to control from the initial onset. But instead, we can learn to incorporate strategies to quickly diminish or reduce their severity. And oftentimes we look at why these events might be so strong in the first place, and they're due to some of these different things that people might be inclined or naturally do, such as engaging in dichotomous or all or nothing thinking, like either something is entirely good or it's entirely bad. Maybe just focusing on the negative and discounting the positive pieces of what's happening, or doing things like catastrophizing where you're really planning out or expecting the worst case scenario. And once you can identify that these are the things that you're engaging in, you can then start to attempt to reduce them once you're aware of these things that are happening. And I think it's a good kind of point to make in general that a lot of what these therapies are aimed at doing, at least from the cognitive approach, is identifying these problems and bringing them to your awareness. And so once you're aware of them and you're aware of how you behave to these problems, you can then start to change these problems either beforehand or in the moment so that you have strategies and tools to reduce the severity of how you respond to situations. And this all kind of comes together with this idea of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so this idea generally centers around using cognitions and thoughts, understanding our thoughts and understanding how they relate to our behaviors, and being able to then control more of those thoughts, those beliefs, to then change those actions and those behaviors. And overall, this is a really common technique that is used in therapy that is designed to, again, understand the relationship between all of these components, both the cognitive beliefs and thoughts, and how those relate to your actions. And once you can understand those connections, you have more control, more awareness, and you're able to then adapt and change and manipulate those beliefs and those feelings to then in turn eventually reduce or eliminate negative behaviors. And this is all done through the term that we call cognitive restructuring.